already have a chocolate donut.
I'm just more wondering how I lost it when I didn't go anywhere.
Okay. All right, this is the only class where I have a video clip, so it's always a challenge trying to get all of the technical things working the right way. Okay, so we'll get started. Trying to see who's here and who's...
Oh, yeah.
We lost the sign-in sheet? Oh.
I have my pen by the sign-in sheet.
Oh.
So you can get my pen.
Here's an extra one. We got lots of... Okay. All right, sorry for the delay, the technical. We'll have to figure out what we do when we get to the video portion. The class we're going to talk about, so either you have a handout here or we've got the handout that you can click in, which is basically just all of the slides that we're going to go through. What we want to talk about in this class, so when we first put it together, probably 10, 12 years ago, meth labs were a big problem in Utah. There was, and kind of across the country. So meth kind of became a bigger issue here in Utah, especially in the real estate scene, probably in the 2006, 2004 era. That's when some of the laws started being enacted for meth labs and meth contamination and all of that. So that's where we start seeing things. This class is really geared around meth labs, but just the reality is we don't see a whole lot of labs here in Utah anymore, or even across the country. Just with some of the things that they did 8 years ago when it made it harder to buy like Sudafed. You couldn't just go buy 10 boxes of Sudafed to stock up. Now you have to give them your license number or whatever, your ID, and they track how many you're buying when it comes to cold medicine. That did a lot for, kind of thwarting a lot of the labs that we would see. So this class is still geared towards, just so you have a good understanding of meth labs, but just to emphasize that what we still deal with, and probably just as much as we have in the last few years, if not getting worse, is meth contamination in a home, but from people using, not just from cooking. We're going to talk a lot about just as, the meth issue, kind of the history and kind of where we are. But then we'll talk a little bit about remediation and cleanup and some of those things as well. And then the other thing too is this, I think technically this class is called Clandestine Drug Labs, or CDLs, because in many parts of the country, especially back east, that's how you refer to them. It's a CDL. And so working with some of the pillar to post offices over there that helped put this this class together, the presentation, it kind of evolved. No one knows them as a CDL here in Utah. Everybody calls them Meth Labs. A CDL is any sort of clandestine drug lab, which could be any of these drugs that you could be producing in your garage, for example. But meth usually accounts for about 80 to 90% of them. So CDL or clandestine lab, meth lab are kind of synonymous. So this is the video. I'm going to skip it. I'll maybe see if we can email it out if anyone's interested. It has lots of good information. It's just a 5-minute clip, but it goes through, there's actually like an hour-and-a-half documentary that they did on it, and just talks about all the impacts of meth on communities. But the clip was just talking, basically one of the, I think it's Oregon Sheriff's Department, that really was kind of leading the charge on a lot of drug and kind of getting over the whole meth lab. It was in that county where they started tracking the inmates that were coming in and seeing the faces of meth. We'll see a picture of it, where people are deteriorating, and you could start to see the physical effects of what meth was doing to people. And that became this huge DEA campaign called the Faces of Meth, and they used that in high schools and junior highs to try to scare kids from getting involved with meth. So all of that kind of, and so the video talks a lot with this sheriff, and he shows, basically him and his team show the producers, this is how easy it is to make meth. And he says you're basically following instructions like you'd be making cookies, adding this ingredient, adding this one, cook it this, do this, and you end up with meth. And so they go through this whole process. They show it's not that, they don't go through all the steps, and they even say, we don't want copycatters, so we're leaving out key steps. But within a matter of hours, they've produced, $300 worth of meth, and it's like, okay, if I've got an addiction, why am I going to go spend $300? On the other hand, too, if I can make $300, I can double that, I can make some extra money. And so that was kind of how Meth Labs became so prolific, because it was common household items, and you have a stove and some cookware, and you can kind of cook it up. And we'll go through a lot of those ingredients and things here in a little bit. But the main message was just that it is something that anyone could do, and that's why it became so common. So just to kind of give, there's our first keyword. For those of you on the virtual, make sure you look at the screen, write that down. Okay. So history. Back in the 80s is when you started seeing meth labs pop up. And it was really just in California. There was a little bit in Philadelphia. But that was kind of really, from what we can see, that's where it was mostly found. In the video it talks about, it was actually, it started coming from some additives that were in farm feed and ephedrine. A lot of biker gangs would hide it in the crankcases. So the term crank, that's how it got that term, is it would be hidden and transported in the crankcases of the motorcycles. But what really was the turning point, it was in the 80s is when all these cold medicines started coming out. And so instead of this obscure chemical that's in some farm feed and some other things, now it's in Sudafed, which, everybody my age as a kid, that was just, you had that in your medicine cabinet. When you got the sniffles, Sudafed and cold medicines and ephedrine. And so now you had this ingredient that if you could extract it and manipulate it a little bit, you ended up with meth. So you start to see in the 80s, by 2002, it starts to spread. The other key factor of why it's now spreading so much in those 20 years, the internet. I mean, the internet kind of came about in the early 2000s. So now you have these recipes that, if you know where to look on the internet, you can find the recipe. You can go to your garage, go to the hardware store, and get the ingredients that you need, and you can cook up meth in your garage or kitchen or wherever. So pretty much by 2007, you have meth all over, every state and province throughout North America. It's pretty bad. They're raiding. At one point, I remember it was how many meth labs did we close down this year? And it was in the 400s, 600s. It was crazy.
So actually, when I was a kid, our next door neighbor had a meth lab, and there was a whole police raid out there too. So the whole street was covered in about 4 plus cop cars, and handful of them just all pointing their guns at the house.
Where was this?
What?
Where was that?
South Jordan.
So it was pretty much everywhere. We'll talk about kind of a little bit more about that in a little bit. So this is Faces of Meth. So some of the side effects, we'll talk about that, but basically there's a lot of physical deterioration that goes along with taking meth, and some of it is quickly, 3 months, several years. My opinion is I think this is good, but this also stereotyped meth users to a degree where a lot of people that I encounter now, where a family will call and say, hey, I need you to test my house. We found out my son, my husband, my daughter, they've been doing meth. This is what they expected, and since they didn't see that, even though, they're acting different, but they don't look like that, so no, it can't be meth. So, just my own opinion, I think this kind of did some damage in that it stereotyped it to the point that a lot of people don't recognize the true signs of meth abuse. It's powerfully addictive. We'll talk about that here, just some vocabulary. This slide, I mainly kept it in. I remember doing an inspection, and we talked to the neighbor. It was a vacant house, and the neighbor's like, oh yeah, they kicked those tenants out. And it's like, oh, well, do you know, was there meth problems? Oh no, not meth. There was they did some speed and some, and he listed off a bunch of names, which were basically just other names for meth and other drugs. But so just because someone has a different name for it Doesn't mean that it couldn't be meth. Keyword number 2. So grab that one and write that one down. Okay, so here's another thing that a lot of people wonder about. You can take meth in a lot of different ways. You can smoke it, and when you're smoking it, it's either a powder or a little crystal, and so think of it like sugar crystals. You put it in some device, whether it's a glass pipe and you're heating it up to the point where it's burning and you're inhaling the fumes. That's the smoking. These are kind of some of the reasons why you might choose one over the other. You could inject it. You can snort it, or you can take pills, an oral ingestion. A lot of people get addicted through, it's a little pill. It's an upper. So I'm just popping pills. It's no difference. And then you need, that's not doing it for me. And so then that's where you start getting to these other.
How close? I've always wondered this. How closely related is drugs like Adderall to meth? I mean, how is that where the abuse starts? And I'm just always been curious to that.
I don't have a legit answer.
It's fine.
So as far as why people and what some of the side effects are, we talk about, long lasting. Well, what's long lasting? So the big effects, so some of the biggest ones that people get hooked on meth, one is it makes, here's the easier way to put it. Think of the happiest, most euphoric moment of your life. Maybe it was your wedding day, maybe it was the birth of a child, maybe it was when they finally left for college. Whatever it was, that day of euphoria, those feelings and emotions, especially tied to that memory, that's a chemical reaction that happens in the brain, and it's usually dopamine that triggers that. Well, when you take a hit of meth, it triggers a dopamine reaction which will pretty much supersede any euphoric moment that you've ever had in your life. So depending on how you want to define an addiction, after your first hit of meth, you will always crave that feeling of euphoria. And so happiness, euphoric, just that feeling of I'm on top of the world, I'm on cloud 9, that's the number one thing that gets people hooked. Gives you tons of energy. So it's not like other drugs too, where say marijuana or even alcohol, where it starts to inhibit some of your senses. It can actually heighten your senses. So actually, we talked about meth back in the 80s, but meth has been around for a long time. There's a lot of reports of it being used a lot in World War II. In fact, one of the more popular recipes is called Nazi meth. I mean, there's reports that some of the kamikaze pilots were very happy as they flew into the ships, things like that. So it's been around for a while. I remember I can't remember if it was the same documentary or another documentary, it talked about, I think it was Malaysia, until just a few years ago, it was actually still legal. So it wasn't unusual for you to have a big factory full of workers, and the boss comes in and says, hey, we just got a big order, we got to pull an all-nighter, there's meth in the back room, get to work, and I remember watching an interview where I think the guy was a painter, and so he was like, it's I'd go take a hit of meth and I could work for 72 hours straight. It's also an appetite suppressant, so not only do I have a lot of energy, I want to get a lot of work done, I don't need to stop and eat. So
maybe why they deteriorate.
And so there's a few factors there. So weight loss drug makes you happy, makes you energetic, which is kind of one of the reasons why in 2006 they did a study here in Utah and they found more women were abusing meth. Well, more women were treated for meth abuse than alcohol abuse back in 2006. And the demographic were women of childbearing years. So that's why, if you remember a decade ago, there were some billboards and stuff that would talk about common nickname for meth abuser, and it had like a charm bracelet that said "mommy." And there was another one that had a hippie bus and a Dodge Caravan, and it says, where do Utah meth abusers, transport their drugs? It is emphasizing that it's the soccer mom drug was the other, nickname for it. So because you think about it, it gives you energy, makes you happy, helps you lose weight. Kind of that demographic, and so kind of a long roundabout answer, but that's kind of why people get hooked on it.
So, I mean, you know, in the injection and the smoking it, that's obviously a few minutes, you know, you're kind of constantly smoking at that point. In the snorting and oral, where you have up to 12 hours, what is the price tag of this addiction? I mean, if it's lasting 12 hours, you're having to take a hit twice a day on that. What is it cost?
And I don't know, I'm going off of kind of what was in the video that we would have seen, but he holds it up, and it's, you know, they've managed to produce, it's probably like 2 or 3 tablespoons worth. And he says, yeah, this will support an addict for a week or two. And it's about $300 worth. Okay. And that was about 10, 15 years ago.
So it's relatively inexpensive.
Yeah.
If you're middle class.
Yes. So a few more things. As far as our concerns in the real estate industry, smoking is the only one that's going to contaminate a home. Well, I guess if you're injecting it and you injected it on the wall and that happens to be where you test it, technically that area is contaminated. You know, if you're taking it, but
cooking it would contaminate.
Cooking it would contaminate it because it's putting off a lot of chemicals into the air as well. Let's see here. So Meth Labs, where are they found? And the thing too, in the last 5-10 years, if you go on YouTube or Google shake and bake, that's kind of the term that they use. But they've perfected the recipes now where you don't even need this elaborate cooking system. You have kids that are getting busted walking into high school where they're mixing up the ingredients in a 2-liter bottle in their backpack. And it's a series of, okay, chemical reaction is heating it up, it's boiling, it's pressurized, okay, you gotta release that pressure, you gotta add this other chemical, and so kids are mixing it up while, in their backpack. And so it's the whole Meth Lab has evolved a lot in the last 10 years. So really there's nowhere that you can't just say, oh yeah, I don't think that was a meth house. We just went to a house a few weeks ago because they finally got rid of the tenants, and it was, the agent called us because they wanted to list it, and the owner is like trying to get it cleaned up, and the agent took a look at it and is like, you need to get someone to test this for meth. I don't even want to touch it until. And I walked in and it was like, oh yeah, nothing was detected. But then on the other hand, we'll have houses and it'll be like, yeah, we're going to test for meth just because we're concerned about it. Okay, yeah, nice, $1 million house, yep, and it tests positive. So my experience has been about 50% of the homes that I'm pretty sure are meth, they have that look, they don't have any meth in them. And of the really nice houses that we end up testing, it's 20-30% of them actually test up with traces of, we just did one, a friend of mine called, they're buying a house in the neighborhood, the lady is finally, kids are moved out, it's a bigger house, they like the neighborhood, they're moving in, yeah, let's do a meth test just to be sure, because there were some kids that were kind of, that tested, not contaminated, but there was meth in the house, and and it does raise these questions.
Usually from the kids that come back home, live in the basement.
And that's the biggest one, because I always hear, should we do a meth test? And and hopefully, and I don't imagine any of you guys would ever do this, but the agent will be like, oh no, grandma's been living here for 50 years. She's not going to be doing meth. Well, where does the wayward grandchild go? Live with grandma. So we do find it a lot. And then another report, this was like 3 or 4 years ago, showed that the geriatric community 70 plus was one of the largest growing meth abusers demographic. You might lose your hair, might get thin, you're happy in energy, you might lose your teeth. You can see that demographic saying, okay, what's the downside?
Well, they actually kind of made a joke on that on a show that I used to watch back in about 10 years ago, actually. I think it was Little Miss Sunshine, where they were talking about drugs, and the grandpa was actually kicked out of his retirement home for doing them. But the thing that was they made the joke out of is the kid was caught doing drugs, the teenager, the grandpa looked at him like, you're an idiot for doing drugs at your age. I can't believe you're touching that stuff. Yep. And then his daughter was like, well, Dad, you got kicked out of your retirement home. He said, well, I'm old, it's ridiculous, so I'm not doing it.
And that's kind of, so bottom line message is there really isn't a stereotype or what's going to be a meth house. there's clues, and that's kind of what we want to talk about. We got to cruise through this. That's some of the things that we want to, cover in this class is signs that you would look for, especially if you're in a landlord situation, of things to watch for with tenants, because a lot of the signs are going to be when activities are happening, not going into a house that's been vacated. Some of these are red flags, but a lot of these are things that you're going to run into anyway. One that we get questions a lot is the cat urine smell. So ammonia is one of the key ingredients in a lot of these recipes. Ammonia, cat urine, very similar smell. I get people will call, clients, agents, hey, we just looked at this house, really stinks like cat urine. Do you think it was a meth house? Okay, well, did you see, does it look like there's cats? The thing is if it was ammonia it would have had to have been recently cooked. It's usually during the cooking process that you're gonna smell that. Now, if you're going by a house and it smells like cat urine, but they don't have cats, yes, that would be a big red flag. If the house has been vacant for 2 or 3 months and it's been smelling like cat urine for 2 or 3 months, it's probably cats. Other chemical odors. So some of these are things that I've talked to remediation contractors, when they go and do the decontamination, and what do they find? So just some other side effects. When people are high on meth, we talked about kind of all those reasons why people might get hooked. But once you're hooked and addicted, one of the other side effects is you get very paranoid. So paranoia is very, this taped up or blacked out windows.
What? Euphoria.
Euphoria?
I guess immediately when you come off, there's the paranoia.
Then the paranoia. I'm going to get caught. It's like, well, that's why, the hit lasts for a little bit, and then some of those other things start setting in. And that's how one guy explained it to me. He's like, we'll go into these houses, and you can tell they've been like tacking up a blanket over the window. But then it's like, oh no, people are going to get suspicious because it's blacked out, so they take it down. Oh no, they're going to see what I'm doing. They tack it up. So he's like, we'll go into some of these houses, and there's like hardly any drywall around the corners of the windows because they've been tacking up and pulling it down and tacking it up so many times. Other stains, so when you're smoking meth, usually you'll burn those crystals down to a little ember that doesn't really burn anymore. And just like you would discard cigarette ash, you just kind of discard that little ember. So you'll find all these little burn marks. So maybe it's right outside where the bedroom was, where the bed was. So you get up, take your hit, discard that little ember, and so there might be those little burn marks all over the floor.
Actually, I have something to kind of bring up, because on the slide you just passed over real quick, I do know somebody that managed a lot of rental properties and short-term rental properties, that he watches out for things you've listed there, where he says when people are applying to rent the properties that he's overseeing, if they want to move in as soon as possible and pay with cash, he typically turns them down because they're a red flag immediately. As well as one of his other properties where he has short-term rentals, he has cameras, and he'll watch as people continue to go up and down, up and down, up and down stairs. And if they do so more than a couple times in a few hours, he goes to the property and asks to view the property. It's like, hey, we just want to see what's going on. We just noticed you've been really busy. What can we help you move? We're noticing you have some problems. And when they don't put them inside, he's like, okay, then we're going to serve you and you need to get out.
Yeah, lots of unusual behavior. Let's see here.
Red stained coffee filters.
So, red stained coffee filters, lots of glass containers, yellow or red staining. So let's talk about the chemicals that go into cooking meth. This is probably hard for most everyone to see. Acetone, alcohol, and it's usually some sort of gasoline additive. Toluene is another ingredient, and that's most commonly found in brake cleaner. Engine starter for the ether, drain cleaner for the sulfuric acid. Coffee filters, iodine.
Sounds like a suicide drug.
It really does.
So iodine, and it's usually in larger quantities, and so you can go down to IFA or veterinary supply, and you can buy gallons of iodine that's used on the farm. Well, you go in and find 3 gallons of iodine in your BYU condo, it's kind of a red flag.
Making soap.
Yeah, making soap. And lithium batteries. Lithium is another big ingredient. Propane tanks. So propane tanks, are often used to transport some of these different chemicals. And one of the ones, very often ammonia will get transported in the propane tank. What happens is, you've probably seen how copper turns kind of green when it gets oxidized. Well, when brass, which is what the valve on a propane tank is made out of, gets oxidized from ammonia, it turns bright blue. And so, I'm not going to try to switch through some other pictures that kind of show what it is. There's been some alerts. It also makes the brass become very brittle. So they've issued alerts to a lot of gas stations saying, hey, if you ever get an exchange and it's bright blue, don't touch it. There's been explosions because people, it gets knocked, it gets brittle, and propane. So I remember, in teaching this class, I get to a house in Riverton, and it was a flip, and I just happened to lift up the lid to the garbage can that was in the garage, just what have they been throwing away? There's a little propane bottle with a bright blue valve on it. Okay, let's do a meth test. And yeah, it was 3 or 4 times over the limit. So that there are some of these red flags.
Is there danger to like walking through a home that's that contaminated, just breathing in like all these chemicals, or not necessarily?
Not
like,
necessarily.
10 minutes you're in there type thing.
So here's the thing. Hold that thought, because we're going to talk a little bit about the contamination and some of the hazards. Keyword number 3. Make sure you look at that. Write it down. Okay, so if you think you have an active lab, you don't want to be around. It's very dangerous. You have a lot of explosive chemicals, volatile chemicals, hazardous waste, not to mention lots of unstable, unpredictable people that might be present as well. I teach in this class, I had an agent tell me that she had a duplex and one of the units was vacant. It was late at night, but she was on her way home. She knew she'd had a bunch of showings, so she wanted to stop by and make sure it got locked up. As she's going, walking towards, it's at night, a guy jumps out of the bushes, and he was an undercover cop, and they were about ready to raid the other unit because there was a meth lab. So, yeah, be cautious if you're with your listings. That is actually where we have had a number of cases over the years where the home is vacant and it tests positive. And so it's like, well, I doubt anyone in the family, but if you think about it, if a bunch of kids in the neighborhood want to go and smoke meth, oh yeah, so-and-so's house was vacant, and yeah, I know how to get into their house because we'd sneak in with their kids all the time. So vacant houses are another one that we run into a lot. So as far as drug laws and really the bottom line is it safe? What are the dangers? What are the hazards, especially when it comes to buying real estate? So just a recap on the laws. 2004 is when it went into effect as far as the Utah actually having laws defining meth contamination. For you guys, 2009, it actually protects real estate agents, so you guys are not held liable in case they didn't disclose it or anything, because that became an issue of, well, you sold me this house, I'm going to sue you. So,
Right.
So state law, if an owner or lessor of a real property has actual knowledge that the property is currently contaminated from the use, storage, or manufacture of methamphetamines, the owner, blah, 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 shall disclose it. And then this is, and I don't know if this is the current one, but I took this a while back from the actual disclosure statement. It says, to your knowledge, is the property currently contaminated from the use, storing, or manufacture of methamphetamines? My message here is, it's buyer beware, because most sellers are going to say, I don't know. Yeah, I kicked them out because they were doing drugs, but I don't know if it's contaminated. Or, yeah, I did a test and it seemed high, but I don't think I did the test right, so I'm not really positive that it's actually contaminated. So, and then the other, worst case scenario is, no, it was contaminated. I hired this company, they came out and cleaned it up. I've had 2 cases in my career where, yeah, here's the certificate. See, we got it all cleaned up. And I'm like, oh, let's do another test. No, it's still contaminated. They didn't clean over here. Look how dirty, And so it is buyer beware when it comes to those things. Now, as far as the cleanup goes, and hold on, because I want to talk. I thought we had a slide
Can I
here.
ask a question?
Yes.
So are there kits that you can buy online that would do the test?
Yes. Hold that thought, because we are going to talk about testing here in just a second. I thought I had a kit with me, but Yes, hold that thought. So back to dangers and risks. When a lot of the original laws came out in Utah, it was actually if there was any detectable meth amount, it was considered contaminated. Fast forward about 10 years, they lowered that, so that was 0.1 micrograms. Now it's 1 microgram, so it's 10 times what it originally was. Some states have now gone to 2.5 micrograms. And what it comes down to, and again, this is more just kind of my interpretation of what I've seen, is there was a lot of hazards that they found, and they were able to say, yeah, people living in these homes, they got this sickness. But when you are talking about a home that's contaminated from someone smoking meth versus a home where meth was cooked, you've got all those other chemicals that people are getting that toxicity into their system. And so at first it was like, wow, yeah, even these, all these law enforcement going into these homes on a regular basis, they were getting very sick. You're not getting exposed to that if it's not a lab situation. If you guys know Ann Atkins with Meth Mob, she teaches a lot of these classes. She'll argue and say, I bet if I go ahead and test any one of your guys' floorboards in your car, I'm going to get meth. Because you've probably walked through a house with meth in it. The meth is going to be more of an issue. What they're now finding is, yes, if you're living in there constantly, it can be off-gassing. And like any toxic element, your body can be absorbing that and it's not going to do well. But it's going to need to be in larger quantities. Then there's also evidence that with children, it can affect their neurological development. So children, especially little ones that are crawling around on the floor and on the areas where those residues from the meth may be, are going to be more susceptible. One of the remediators that I've worked with a lot, he's been doing this. He's actually was involved with the state when some of these original laws were put together. He helped put together a lot of the protocols here in Utah. His argument is, look, even if it were 2 or 3 for a healthy adult, he's like, for me personally, I wouldn't be worried about it. So it kind of is one of those things too where radon, lead paint, any of those things where some people, asbestos, yeah, some people are going to be more susceptible. Some people are going to encounter it in different ways. So right now the state limit is at 1 microgram.
Jared, I have a question. I had a house in Tooele, and we had the certificate, but we had to get it cleaned again. And the second time we had to get it cleaned, they required that the seller remove the sheetrock. Can you tell me why?
I don't know.
It was a really good meth house.
Yeah, I haven't heard that they are requiring removal of sheetrock, especially in the last few years. They've come up with a lot of processes now where the process is you need to remove the residue. The residue is kind of think of it kind of an oily based residue, and so it gets stuck onto everything. It can get absorbed into the drywall. So the removal is usually a combination of some sort of detergent, so a soap-based detergent that's going to break down that oil, and then an oxidizer which is going to break down the meth. And the decontamination is really just scrubbing down every entire surface of the whole home. And so to remove the sheetrock, I don't know. I know that different counties, is Tooele in Salt Lake County?
It's in Tooele County.
Tooele County. So, and it's not just counties, it's the health department jurisdictions, which are sometimes counties. So I don't know if Tooele is part of the Salt Lake. I know Salt Lake is a little more strict compared to Utah County, for example. Like Salt Lake County, I don't care if you put the carpet in yesterday, the house is contaminated, the carpet gets disposed of. Utah County, yeah, you just put it in yesterday. Yeah, we'll let you keep, take it out, clean up. They're a little more lenient, but Salt Lake is a little more. So I don't know if Tooele, I don't know. That would be a good question for Ann with Meth Mob that does a lot of the decontamination. But I haven't heard of any requirement for removal of drywall in years. So that's one I'll find out about. So remediation, cleanup costs. So here's another thing that often comes up is we'll talk to clients and I usually throw out, 10 to 20,000 is what it takes to clean up a meth house. And then the agent will call me and say, what are you talking about? I just called a few people. This guy will come and decontaminate it for $900. So to compare apples to apples, when a home is contaminated, it has to be decontaminated by a certified decontamination specialist. And that process is they have to get it below the state limit. Now, companies like Meth Lab and some few others, they guarantee that they'll get rid of the meth. So there's no traces of meth. But then some companies we'll just get it below the limit and we're good. So there's a variation in cost where most of those companies that guarantee that it'll be gone, you're usually in the $3,000 to $5,000 range. $1,000 to $2,000 range, they're just gonna kind of get it cleaned up. Now, that doesn't account for, part of that cleanup is they're gonna remove all carpeting. If you have any newer houses that have the flex duct has to get disposed of.
So this removal of the carpet is not also replacement of the carpet?
Right, that's what I'm getting at, is that decontamination is not remediation for the meth. Decontamination is just to get the meth out of the house, then you've got to put the house back together. And in that process, if you had flex ducting like up through the attic, and well, that gets torn out, and now you have to replace all the flex ducting. If it's regular, hard metal ducting, they have to cut the sheetrock so they can get in there and scrub it all out. So now you got to patch that, repaint. So 10 to 20,000. Another big one is the furnace. If it's a newer furnace, they'll dismantle it and try to repair it. If it's more than 10 years old, it's like, we're going to charge you an extra $1,000 to clean it, or do you want to put that towards just getting a new furnace? And so there's a lot of costs, and so at least in my experience, most of the people I've talked to, 10 to 20 is a more reasonable amount of what they pay to get your 2,000 square foot house back to uncontaminated status. Health department is kind of oversees that. Okay, testing. The test process, and I thought I had one, I was actually on the phone this morning because my team was running out of kits and ordering more kits. You can get the kits from any health department. The public kits are almost identical to the professional kits. It's the same lab. The lab that we use is located in Taylorsville. And that lab actually developed the protocol that all labs across the nation use. So it's the lab to go to when it comes to meth. That's also why, and this is just my opinion, why I think meth is such a bigger issue in the real estate industry. If you talk to other agents, I talk to inspectors all over the country, and you test for meth. That's not even, because we have the lab and they regularly train home inspectors and regularly train agents, so the awareness in Utah is way higher than the rest of the country. But the lab is reliable. You can get your kit yourself. You can go do the test. You can send it off. It's about $50. The professional kit uses methanol base, and the consumer has an isopropyl alcohol base. Methanol is a little more hazardous, so they don't want the general public using that. Methanol, however, can be about 20% more effective at pulling meth out. If they repaint it over the wall and the meth is behind that layer of paint, methanol is about 20% more effective at pulling it through than isopropyl alcohol. Other than that, the test is the same. When you get a test, meth is reported in how many micrograms per 100 square centimeters. So they give you a little template that's 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, and that's what you're swabbing as an example, as a sample to send off to the lab.
How much is a professional test?
Most inspectors are charging between $100 and $150. Us, for example, we charge, I think, $125 for the first one and then $100 for each one after that.
So do you need,
Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you need multiple kits to test different areas of the home?
Okay, good question. The lab and the protocol, it's one kit per sample. However, one sample can be a composite of up to 4 areas. So in most cases, we'll do what's called a composite sample where we will test 4 areas. And then that gets reported as an average of those 4 areas. So even though we're testing 4 areas, well, which area, we don't know because it's one kit, one sample, one result. The pros and cons, you get a lot more exposure. So especially in our line where we're just, hey, is there a problem? Let's just kind of screen the area. If there's meth, okay, now we need to know what the amount is because the level is 1 microgram. So anything above 1 microgram is considered contaminated. So what happens if you did a composite of 4 areas and your result came back at 0.5? Well, that means one area could have been 2 and the other 3 areas could have been 0, and the average was 0.5. So when we get those, we report it as it's inconclusive. I don't know if the house is contaminated, but I can tell you there is meth in the house. Other question?
I was going to kind of go off this from a failed transaction of mine in my first little bit. And so maybe you can weigh in as well. What had happened is my clients were investors and they paid for the kit themselves and did it all themselves. And they found like a trace of like 0.12 as a total. And they wanted me to use that as a leveraging tactic, even though the Utah law was 1. And that kind of led to that whole thing falling apart. But this is where I'm asking like you, so how much is that encouraged that somebody do it themselves? And secondly, how is that a leveraging tactic if it's not even 1.0?
It was over 1.0.
No, it's 0.12.
Oh, 0.12. Sorry,
Yeah.
I said 1.2.
So it's 0.12.
I mean, if anything, it scares the seller a little bit to go, ooh, we have meth in our house. That means someone else could test and get a higher number, and I can see it being a slight negotiating tactic.
Because the thing that would happen is basically that when it was something I would have done is the seller's agent was like, okay, who'd you have do the test?
Sure,
But it was
yeah.
the clients that did it, not a.
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking more on that is when it's done by a client and not by an inspector or an agency.
Well,
then it
then
doesn't really
it-
seem to hold any validity in the end. It's using it as a tactic.
Yeah, and I see this a lot more with radon, for example, because you can go get a radon test. You can do it a lot cheaper. The recommended level is 4, but it comes in at 3. Well, I still want to put a system. I mean, it's kind of, and that's your guys. Anything's negotiable. I want this wall painted pink. Sorry, I'm not going to do it. Okay. I mean, anything's negotiable, but yeah, that's what I tell people. You can do the radon test yourself. The value of us doing the test, whether it's for meth or radon, is that if it does become an issue to negotiate, that's the value. Is you have a trained,
Legitimate
certified
source.
third party that's providing it. All right, that was keyword number 4. If you saw that, I'm going to skip over this. We're a little bit lower on time. Basically, you can clean it up yourself, but in my experience, I'm actually working with a family right now. Their son contaminated the basement, but they don't have the money to clean it up, so they're trying to clean it up themselves, which I've already gone out and we've tested. Nope, it's still high. So now they had someone else. She was just texting me this morning, hey, we had someone else come in and help us clean up a little bit more. Can you come do some more testing? And it's like, I mean, how many months has this been on the market that it could have been on the market, and just to save a couple $1,000s to clean it up versus her trying to do anyway. So that's something that happens a lot. And this was just the Kansas Department of Health used to have instructions for how to clean up meth, and when you get a chance, if you want to read through them all, it's like how many people do you know that you could rely on them actually following these instructions correctly to actually, I wouldn't recommend that. Okay, we've covered that. So basically just detecting a meth lab or meth contamination, the main message is there's really no indicators. I mean, there are some things that you can, I'll just tell you my experience. If it's a fourplex built in the 70s, one of the units probably has meth. Just because it's been around long enough and you've had enough of that demographic that's more likely to use meth going in and out, that's just my experience. That's not just a stereotype, or that's just what I'm finding. We do fourplexes, and yep, one of them comes up positive. And if there's things like locked bedroom, like deadbolts on a bedroom door, that's another kind of something that we see that kind of red flag. Just other things to consider. I've talked to a lot of remediators that are doing cleanup on brand new construction. You've got a lot of workers that are really being pushed to get things done, and so that extra energy, low appetite does great to help them get their work done. So meth contamination in new construction is not uncommon. So that's also something to be aware of. Now, can a home be cleaned up? And yes, and that's the thing, is a lot of people, oh no, there's traces of meth, I don't want to deal with it. The thing you need to think about is the process of cleaning up meth is going to leave that home probably more close to sterile and clean environment than even a brand new construction. Because it's going to clean up, it's going to get rid of any bacteria, virus, mold, germ, anything in that house is going to get cleaned up. So other than the stigma of it being a meth house, there's really not health hazards as long as it's cleaned up properly. And that's the caveat, because I've seen a lot of homes that weren't really cleaned up properly and they still tested positive, or, well, yeah, we tested it and it got, we got it below 1. Well, but you didn't test over here. And that's another thing we run into is, I'll do a test for a buyer and it'll come up positive, and the seller won't believe me. They'll hire someone to come and do a test on the opposite wall and it's low. And it's like, well,
It wasn't smoked in this room and it wasn't them.
right. And it's like, well, I mean, we can retest. And so there are those, it's the same thing with radon. You test 1 week, maybe it's low. You test the next week, it could be just a little bit high. So there are variables like that need to be considered.
Can I ask a question maybe? How does that stigma affect the valuation of the home? If it's been in the past, does that affect the
It
valuation?
shouldn't. It's technically not supposed to be a stigmatized property, just like if there was a death in the home. It's not supposed to, but
Yeah, I think you look at it more like a preference, right? There's people that are like, this doesn't scare me, I'll go in and get it cleaned up. There's people that are like,
yeah, we've had clients that are like, oh, there's meth, no, and they're done. I don't even want to talk about it. I don't want to. And then I have a lot of clients that say, hey, you don't need meth properties. they want to buy them as an investment and look at it as being able
their
to.
renters are going to smoke them. Anyway.
So, I know we're a little bit past on time, but any questions on any of that? I know we kind of got a late start and technical difficulties.
Information.
So, any questions online? I think I've got one more keyword here. Keyword number 5. So, make sure you grab that last keyword so you can submit that. And any other questions, guys?
Or are we submitting the keywords?
You don't need to because you're here in class. That's the requirement for virtual.
Your form only has a slot for 4 keywords.
Oh, it has 4 this time. Okay, last time it had 5, so I added a 5th.
Added a 5th one.
So she took off. So now it's 4. That's all right. If you don't have the 5th one, it'll be good.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jared. We appreciate you coming and teaching us that today. Just because we only had 3 agents show up, do you guys want a couple more tickets to give away to your clients?
Yeah.
Just so you know, they're getting more tickets to give away to their clients because they came in person.
Okay, you'll be the hero on social media today when you say, I got 2 tickets for my clients. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, Jared. That was a great time.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
So if you have any questions.
You have questions? Yep, you're
I'll
more
tell
than
the part.
welcome to. Yep, I've got some cards and brochures, and make sure you grab a truffle. And I only have 2 people that signed up.
Very
So,
dangerous.
signed up for
I just
what?
did mine online.
Okay.
Wait, what do you mean signed up?
Sign if you want credit.
Yeah.
To get CD credit.
Chocolate blues inside.
Oh, is that where we signed up above there?
Looking good.
Oh, if you did, oh. Oh, okay.
You're gonna love it.
Yeah, that was, I taught last week, and we did this class.
Oh, shoot.
So, let's go.
Sorry, I didn't see
No,
it.
you're good. Yeah, I was
I know.
kind of.
I see it there now.
Okay.
Jeanette, you got a sticker right there.
Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey Jared,
Yes.
is there any way I could get a truffle out here in Cedar, please? I would hear.
I will,
Posted.
I will bug Aaron. I think Aaron might have some. Aaron's down in the Cedar City office, so I'll tell him that he needs to stop by.
Okay. That's good, thanks.
It's worth the drive.
See you, Matt.
Yeah.
You can,
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
It's awesome to meet you, man.
Nice to meet you, Connor.
Connor, yeah.
Very cool.
Hope to see you around soon.
Yeah, I know, it's nice to be in class. I love live classes so much better than.
I can't do online. I cannot do it. When I'm online, I don't learn anything. I don't.
I know, I love the interaction and you can ask questions, like hearing it.
Oh, when I'm online, I just walk around and do other things and listen.
I see it too.
I'm like doing my.
What was that? Well,
I-
I text, because then I just found out that
I
the
can't. My brain.
I know.
I also honestly don't know what it's something about
So
my
I
own
text the
personal
agent and said,
makeup.
hey,
I can't remember many things that I hear on a computer or anything
I
like
said,
that.
hey,
So
how come I have one?
I get hearing things on a computer or on a phone.
Cool. He just replied, they're okay with it now?
More.
So, yeah, if you want to
Greg,
be there at 1, we'll get started
more
later.
active.
Greg?
Ask.
Greg?
I don't know that.
Okay.
Basically,
lunch,
you know,
I'll just read through
on my phone,
stuff in the
even
meantime,
actually, like,
kind
after
of
that,
on that
so let's see what-
Yeah, there's lots of
I was reading that last
videos
night.
and stuff.
That sounds
that
after
Yeah.
that, before we're actually like, okay, what?
That's why I brought that
I
in.
just started actually like,
You
I'm
know,
sorry,
I'm
if for too long, you can
Play around with
actually
this.
I can't hear this anymore.
I haven't set up
You're
a
done.
voicemail
Yeah.
yet, which is
I'm very much in person, and very called.
Makes a difference for sure.
It's just the way that like,
So,
the more clear it
it's
is,
a
the more
voice,
voice
fill that on the
yeah,
middle
so
thing.
I would
Is it
just
back
really
there?
just say, sorry, wrong number.
Yeah.
You might, yeah, I think all the guys.
Like when it's very clear, it's okay.
Like,